What's going on, guys? Welcome back to Spill the Tea. As you can tell by the title itself, what I really wanted to talk about was something incredibly personal and something that really I have seen that doesn't get discussed enough. And this is also going to be a pretty sensitive subject, especially for myself. And I'm sure, many other people, as this video isn't mainly for every single person. It's mainly for, former foster children, or even, children who grew up in unstable homes. This also, is mainly for, foster parents or caregivers who, want to do right or do better by the children that they're taking care of. And people who may not actually see what's truly happening behind the scenes. Be that voice of reason for especially for children in foster care. Especially for myself, again, I grew up in foster care. I was adopted. I was taken out of my home at a very young, early age. So, and first off, before I even get started on any of this topic, I first want to point out that this video is not to blame anyone. That's not what this video is intended for. There is no blame. I'm not casting blame or judgment on anyone. It's more about just trying to find a better understanding what survival actually looks like, especially for those children who, deal with the foster care system. I know that I can speak from my own personal experience. I also know a couple of other people. And I'm sure, this is where I'm going to assume, a lot of children that are in foster care, you always hear them saying, my foster parents didn't care as much. I remember, again, at many points in time in my life, me saying the exact same statement. And I want to be very, very careful here, because the feeling itself is very real, but the reality of the situation is not. And as I've gotten older, and I've gone through many different feats of therapy. Also, I'm just shy of a year away of getting my bachelor's in psychology, and also being able to reflect on my own life. I've realized something incredibly important, that sometimes it's not that the foster parents don't care. It's sometimes that the child learned to stop opening up. As a foster kid, I learned how to shrink myself. I learned not to ask for help, not to complain, not to share my feelings, and basically not to try to need anything from anyone. Not because, my foster mom or my foster dad never offered anything. Of course they did. It's just me becoming silent became my form of protection. And so when a child, experiences abandonment, especially, for myself, especially at a very young, early age, and you go through that level of abandonment, or sometimes, you have foster children who have repeated placement changes, they're constantly bouncing from foster home to foster home to foster home, or just inconsistent adults, even, their mothers and fathers are maybe in and out of their life. It's just emotional unpredictability is what it becomes. And so I know, again, I can speak from experience, and I'm sure a lot of other people can relate to this. Your nervous system, starts to learn one thing. And the safest way for you to survive is to just take up less space. It's to stop asking for things, stop, expressing your emotions, stop expressing your needs. And so that child starts to adapt. They become incredibly quiet. They become very easy, as other people will say. Oh, he's such an easy guy. Like we barely ever hear a peep out of him. They start to develop this independence. Beyond their age. They're very young, and so they're not ready to be independent yet. And so they try to also stay emotionally neutral. And a lot of parents, foster parents, caregivers, aunts, uncles, who's ever taken care of this child. Even, there was one stint with one of my relatives, and she actually stayed with one of our social workers for quite some time. And sometimes that social worker may say, or that caregiver, they're so well behaved. They never ask for anything, and they're very mature. And what you're often seeing isn't maturity. That's just self-erasure. They're just kind of erasing who they are. They're shrinking themselves. Excuse me, I apologize. So, if you're a foster parent or a caregiver, an aunt, uncle, mom, dad, whoever it is, some signs that I would like to bring to light, that you can keep an eye out for, that, that's a signal that your child is kind of, shrinking themselves emotionally, is that, that they rarely ask for help, even when they clearly need it. You absolutely know when they need it, but they're just refusing to ask for it. They will instantly say, I'm fine, automatically. And I have done that repeatedly through many, many years of my life, for decades of my life. Even when I needed people the most, and I needed that help, and I was so tired of feeling like the whole world was on my shoulders, I needed help, but I would never say anything. I would just say, I'm fine. They avoid expressing, their angers, their sadnesses, or their disappointments. And they also try not to complain, even when something is clearly wrong with them. And this is the first also telltale sign, is they over apologize. You could even sit there and discuss it with somebody. And this happens also even in my personal life with my own daughter, where sometimes she over apologizes for nothing. She'll be talking to me and she'll tell me a story, and then she'll instantly say, "Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe I'm talking too much." And I say, "Lila, you're fine. You're beautiful. Keep going. I'm listening to your story." Most children in the foster care system, they start to withdraw instead of acting out. Some act out. I cannot dismiss that. But some try to withdraw themselves instead of acting out. And it's not that those kids are easy. They're just learning to protect themselves. That's all it is. One of the biggest mistakes adults make is assuming. And every single human being assumes everything. And I try not to make it feel like I'm putting blame on anyone, so please, this is not what that video is about. But most times parents will say, well, if they needed anything, they'd tell me. And you are absolutely right. To a normal child, normal children will absolutely come to you when they need something. Absolutely. But when a child is starting to withdraw for protecting himself, they may not come to you. They may not talk to you. They may feel scared opening up to you. They may feel scared even asking for any kind of help. Because along the way, they learn that needing doesn't lead to being safe. And that's something a child starts to unlearn, throughout time. And I would hate to see them walk the same path that I had to learn. Here is what actually does help, though, and this applies to any child. Even my own children, I still do it. You stop asking just once. Start asking consistently. I understand it may become annoying or repetitive, but by being consistent, it allows them to feel safe, that somebody actually truly cares. You can constantly ask them, hey, how was your day today? Did anything feel hard? And I'm here if you want to talk. And by doing this consistently, it reinforces that safety for them. Normalize their feelings without trying to force them to come out. Instead of saying to a child, why don't you talk to me? You know what I mean? We could try, and this is stuff that I try again, even with my own daughters who don't suffer through this, and it works tremendously. You can say a lot of kids who have been through hard things keep stuff inside. And that makes sense. It makes sense to feel scared, not to want to open up. And that tells the child that, you're not broken. I'm here for you. One thing that we don't really want to do is we don't really want to reward that silence. As we all know, whoever has children, kids are never fully silent. And especially if you have toddlers and all this other stuff, we all know that when children go silent, that means something is going on. And that's when your adult receptors kick in and you start scanning for, oh God, what are they getting into? So let's try not to reward some of that, you know what I mean? Be careful praising the kids for, being too easy or low maintenance, because what they start to hear is, I feel loved most when I need nothing from anyone. So you always want to try to reinforce that effort, that honesty, and that emotional expression, even if it seems like a little bit messy. What I do also works best, especially with my children, is I model that vulnerability. Sometimes I will go to my daughter, and my daughter absolutely knows everything. I'm very transparent with my daughter to an extent. Again, she's only 14, so, she's not at that mature level to hear everything, but when I make mistakes in life, I am open and honest and vulnerable with her. I tell her, hey, listen, Lila, Dad made a big mistake. And this is what Dad did. He did X, Y, and Z. And this is what Dad learned, and this is what Dad needs to be able to work on. And by modeling that level of vulnerability, it has allowed her to be vulnerable with me on many different occasions. It allows us to connect on that emotional level, and it provides that safe place for her to know that no matter what, I'm always going to be there for her. To look out for her, to guide her, even to correct her, even when I tell her, I understand that your feelings, and your feelings are absolutely valid because that's exactly how you feel, and then there are times where I try to guide her down that right path, and I say, again, your feelings are absolutely correct, that's how you feel, but how we handle it is what we need to work on. And she listens, she pays attention, and she starts applying those things. Again, she's a child. Again, she's human, just like all of us, where sometimes you may mess up, and that's normal. That's happened. But by modeling that vulnerability, by admitting not only to yourself, but also to them, hey, listen, I made a mistake, or I had a rough day, or, I'm an adult as well, too. I'm still learning things. That gives them that sense of permission to be human. And one last thing that I would love to touch on is, especially for the children that may be watching this, if you are watching this and you're starting to think, hey, that's me, I want you to hear this as clear as day. You didn't fail to open up. I understand that you survived. At one point in time, maybe you were like me, where staying silent and shrinking yourself and neglecting your own needs and not putting yourself first, it did keep you safe at one time. It absolutely did. It did for me. But you don't have to live like that forever. You're allowed to take up that space. You're allowed to ask for help. You're allowed to be human and to share your emotions and to share your experiences. And that's one thing that I would love to be able to give back. Again, growing up in the foster care system, that was one thing that I've always wanted to do with my whole life, is to be there, be that kind of beacon of light, especially for the children that are going through the things that I went through my whole life. Because I can easily relate to how you may feel, or what you may start thinking, or how you may start acting. Even if you lash out, or even if you just kind of segregate yourself from the world. I've done both. And the ultimate message is, I just want you to know that you're not alone. You're not. And I'm hoping that any portion of this video kind of resonated with anyone with it. If it did, please share it. Comment, like, subscribe. Especially if this resonated with somebody who works with kids, or takes care of kids, or is a foster parent or a caregiver, or if anyone, again, grew up like this in the foster care system. I've learned a lot throughout my whole life experience. I've also learned even more following my degree into psychology. I learned a heck of a lot as I was juggling both and working a full-time job, and also writing my first book, A Child Called Home, which will be out very shortly. And that book is all about, survival and learning how to come back to yourself. I've also created a deeper guide. So it's a little resource that's on Gumroad, and it's considered. It's just there for support. It's called Founded at the Right Time, and that link is actually in the description below. And thank you for being here. You're not alone, and you were never broken to begin with.